The barrel of Jake Morrison's rifle trembled as 50 Apache warriors tightened their circle around his ranch house. Behind him, the pregnant girl he'd found bleeding in his barn clutched a piece of blood-stained cloth, evidence that could either save hundreds of lives or get them both killed in the next 60 seconds. The war chief's son stepped forward, his painted face twisted with murderous intent, and Jake realized that everything he thought he knew about honor, justice, and his own bitter heart was about to be tested by the most impossible choice of his life. Jake Morrison pressed his weathered hand against the barn door, listening to the rain hammer his Arizona ranch like bullets from heaven. At 45, the former Union cavalry officer had grown accustomed to storms, both the kind that soaked through wooden planks and the kind that lived permanently in his chest. The whiskey on his breath mixed with the smell of wet earth and horse manure, a combination that somehow made perfect sense in 1878. His cattle ranch sat perched on the edge of Apache territory like a dare, written in timber and barbed wire. Most folks thought he was crazy for staying out here alone. Truth was, Jake preferred the company of longhorns to people these days. Cattle didn't ask questions about the Indian Wars or why his hands shook when thunder rolled across the desert. Lightning split the sky, illuminating something that shouldn't have been there. A figure collapsed near his feed troughs, dark hair plastered against pale skin. Jake's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, old habits from too many Apache raids where hesitation meant death. But this wasn't a warrior preparing an ambush. This was a girl, maybe 18, with arrows protruding from her shoulder like deadly decorations. Apache arrows. Jake's jaw clenched as memories of his fallen men flashed through his whiskey-soaked brain. How many good soldiers had died from arrows just like these? His boot stayed planted on the porch for a long moment, rain soaking through his shirt while he wrestled with a simple choice: walk away or step into whatever mess this represented. Then he noticed something that changed everything. She was pregnant. The girl's condition hit him like a physical blow, stirring something he thought the war had killed completely. His medical training from battlefield hospitals kicked in before his prejudice could stop him. Jake scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her into his cabin as thunder shook the walls. By lamplight, the arrows looked even worse. Professional shots designed to wound rather than kill quickly. Jake had seen enough Apache warfare to recognize the craftsmanship, but something felt wrong about the angles. These weren't cavalry-issued arrows shot in self-defense. These came from Apache bows, which meant her own people had done this to her. What kind of crime makes your own tribe hunt you with lethal intent? As Jake cleaned her, wounds with steady hands that remembered saving lives instead of taking them, the girl's eyes fluttered open. Terror filled them when she saw his face, the scarred features of a man who'd fought her people for years. But instead of trying to escape, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Nasha," she whispered through cracked lips. "Nasha? Kill, peace man." Jake's hands froze. Peace negotiations had been happening for months between the Apache and local settlements. If someone had murdered a negotiator, it meant war was coming, whether anyone wanted it or not. The girl, Sitala, she managed to say when he asked her name, kept repeating the same word, Nasha. Then she did something that shattered every assumption Jake had built about Apache people over years of bitter fighting. She reached into her torn dress and pulled out a piece of cloth, beautifully beaded in distinctive patterns. The fabric was stained with blood that clearly wasn't hers. Through broken English and desperate gestures, Sitala painted a picture that made Jake's stomach turn. She'd witnessed Nasha, a war chief's son, murder the peace negotiator in cold blood. When she tried to stop him, he'd torn his shirt in the struggle, leaving her holding the evidence. Rather than face justice, Nasha had blamed her for the killing and convinced the tribe to hunt her down. Now 50 Apache warriors would soon follow her trail straight to Jake's front door, believing they were chasing a murderer when they were actually being led by one. Jake stared at the blood-stained cloth in Sitala's trembling fingers, his mind racing faster than the storm outside. The beadwork told a story his military training couldn't ignore. Each pattern was specific to individual warriors, like fingerprints made of thread and tradition. If this really came from Nasha during a struggle, it was evidence that could prevent a massacre. The problem? Getting anyone to believe them before the arrows started flying. Sitala's fever broke around midnight, and with it came a flood of desperate communication. She drew pictures in the dirt floor with shaking fingers, crude stick figures that painted a horrifying scene. The peace negotiator, a man Jake recognized from her drawings as Thomas Whitman, had been meeting secretly with Apache leaders. Nasha had ambushed him, not for tribal honor, but for personal gain. War meant profit for some people. Nasha had been selling information to gun runners who thrived on conflict between settlers and tribes. Peace would end that lucrative arrangement, so peace had to die with Thomas Whitman. Jake's whiskey-addled brain struggled to process the implications. He'd spent years believing every Apache was his enemy, but here was one risking her life to prevent exactly the kind of bloodshed that had haunted his nightmares. The irony tasted more bitter than the rot-gut whiskey he'd been drowning himself in. "Why tell me?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure she'd understand. Sitala pointed to her belly, then made a cradling motion with her arms. She didn't need perfect English to communicate the universal language of a mother protecting her unborn child. War would mean death for everyone, Apache and white alike. Her baby deserved better than a world soaked in unnecessary blood. Then there's the matter of trust, which neither of them had much experience with across enemy lines. Jake found himself studying her face in the lamplight, looking for deception he'd been trained to spot. Instead, he saw something that reminded him of his own mother, fierce protective instinct mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. When had he stopped seeing Apache people as individuals and started viewing them as a single, threatening mass? The answer sat heavy in his chest like bad food. Somewhere between watching his men die and learning to hate everything that moved in buckskin. Morning brought the sound Jake had been dreading. Horses approaching in formation. Military precision, but from the wrong army. He peered through his window shutters and counted at least 50 warriors spread in a perfect circle around his property. Professional work that left no escape routes. Sitala tried to stand when she heard the horses, but Jake gently pushed her back down. Her arrow wounds were healing, but she was in no condition to run. Not that running was an option with that many skilled trackers surrounding them. "Stay hidden," Jake said, checking his rifle with hands that had stopped shaking for the first time in months. Strange how facing certain death could steady a man's nerves. The war chief who rode forward was exactly what Jake expected. Weathered face marked by years of hard decisions, eagle feathers that had been earned through deeds Jake probably didn't want to imagine. But his eyes held intelligence, not mindless hatred. This was a leader who preferred strategy to slaughter when possible. Beside him rode a younger warrior whose painted face radiated barely contained violence. Nasha. Even without introductions, Jake recognized the murderer from Sitala's desperate drawings. The resemblance to the war chief marked him as family, probably a son being groomed for leadership through whatever means necessary, including framing pregnant girls for murders they witnessed instead of committed. "We seek the woman who killed our peace brother," the chief called out in accented but clear English. "Give her to us and you will not be harmed." Jake stepped onto his porch, rifle held ready but not directly threatening. Years of military diplomacy kicked in, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. One wrong word would turn his ranch into a battlefield, where he was outnumbered 50-1. "What proof do you have she killed anyone?" Jake called back. Nasha's horse pranced sideways, his rider's agitation clear even from a distance. "She was found with blood on her hands. She ran like the guilty run. This is proof enough." But the war chief held up a hand, silencing his son. Experience had taught him that situations involving white settlers required careful handling. Too much bloodshed would bring cavalry units that none of them wanted to face. "The woman carries a child," the chief said. "This makes killing her complicated. But justice must be served for Thomas Whitman's death." Jake's mouth went dry. They knew about the pregnancy, which meant they'd been tracking Sitala closely. These weren't random raiders. This was a formal justice party seeking what they believed was a legitimate criminal. The distinction mattered because it meant they might listen to reason, if he could present it correctly. "What if she didn't kill him?" Jake asked. "What if someone else wanted you to think she did?" Nasha's response came fast and angry. "You speak foolishness, white man. Why would anyone blame an innocent person?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Jake caught the slight tension in the war chief's shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward his son before returning to Jake. Experience reading men in combat situations told him everything he needed to know. Doubt was already present, just buried under family loyalty and political necessity. Well, time to dig it up and put it on display. Because, Jake said carefully, the real killer knew that blaming her would give him exactly what he wanted: war between our peoples, and some people profit from war. The silence that followed was broken only by horses shifting and leather creaking. 50 sets of eyes focused on Jake's porch, while behind him, Satala made a decision that would change everything. Despite his warnings, despite her wounds, despite the impossible odds, she stepped out of the cabin with the blood-stained cloth held high. Her voice carried across the morning air, speaking rapid Apache that Jake couldn't follow but could feel in his bones. Whatever she was saying made Nash's face go pale beneath his war paint. The evidence was about to be presented, and everyone present would have to choose which version of justice they wanted to serve. Sidala's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through leather, her Apache words flowing with the kind of desperate truth that needs no translation. Jake watched Nasha's face drain of color beneath his war paint, while the war chief's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Whatever she was saying hit its target with deadly accuracy. The blood-stained cloth fluttered in her trembling hands like a battle flag made of evidence and hope. "She lies," Nasha shouted, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. "The woman is a murderer who would say anything to save her worthless life." The war chief raised his hand for silence, his weathered face unreadable as carved stone. Years of leadership had taught him to recognize truth when it wore the clothes of desperation. He spoke to Satala in rapid Apache, his questions sharp and probing. Jake couldn't follow the conversation, but he could read body language like a book written in blood and sweat. Nasha shifted in his saddle like a man sitting on hot coals. His father's questions were hitting home with the precision of a cavalry charge. Then Satala did something that made every warrior present lean forward in their saddles. She held up the torn cloth and pointed directly at Nasha's war shirt. The beadwork pattern was unmistakable, like comparing two pieces of the same puzzle. Even from 30 yards away, Jake could see where the fabric had been torn during a struggle. The silence stretched tighter than a bowstring ready to snap. "My son," the war chief said in English, never taking his eyes off the evidence. "Explain how this woman came to possess a piece of your shirt." Nasha's answer came too fast, too practiced. "She must have stolen it, or torn it from my lodge. These white lovers will do anything to avoid justice." But his father wasn't buying merchandise that smelled this rotten. The old chief dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding horses since before he could walk properly. He approached Satala with careful respect, examining the cloth with eyes that had seen enough lies to recognize truth when it presented itself. What happened next made Jake's heart stop beating for a full second. Nasha went for his knife. The young warrior's desperation overrode his survival instincts, and he lunged towards Satala with a war cry that turned the morning air electric with violence. His father might be willing to listen to evidence, but Nasha knew that dead witnesses tell no stories. Jake's military training kicked in faster than conscious thought. His rifle barrel swung toward Nasha while his finger found the trigger. Not because he hated Apache people anymore, but because he'd sworn to protect an innocent woman carrying an unborn child. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder made of gunpowder and justice. Nasha tumbled from his horse, clutching a shoulder wound that would heal but wouldn't kill. Jake had deliberately aimed to wound, not because he was feeling merciful, but because killing the war chief's son would guarantee a massacre even if they proved Satala's innocence. Sometimes honor requires surgical precision instead of overwhelming force. The war chief moved with lightning speed, disarming his wounded son before rage could make the situation worse. His face showed the kind of pain that comes from discovering your own blood has been poisoned by lies and greed. "The truth reveals itself," he said quietly, holding Nasha's knife away from any targets. "My son, you have shamed our people and dishonored the memory of Thomas Whitman." Nasha's protests died in his throat as 50 warriors witnessed his father's judgment. Tribal justice moved swifter than white man's courts, especially when the evidence wore beadwork patterns that couldn't lie. But justice served doesn't always guarantee safety earned, and Jake realized their real test was just beginning as the war chief's eyes turned back toward him and Satala with questions that would determine whether this story ended in peace or started an entirely different kind of war. The war chief's eyes held the weight of mountains as he looked between his wounded son and the woman who'd exposed a truth no father wants to discover. Nasha writhed on the ground, clutching his shoulder while 50 warriors waited to see how their leader would balance family loyalty against tribal honor. Justice doesn't care about bloodlines, and everyone present knew it. Thomas Whitman came to make peace, the chief said, his voice carrying across the desert like wind through canyon walls. My son killed him for silver coins and gunrunner promises. Sitala stepped forward despite her wounds, speaking in Apache that Jake couldn't understand but could feel in his bones. She was offering mercy where she had every right to demand blood. The torn cloth fluttered between her fingers, evidence that had saved hundreds of lives from a war built on lies. Nasha made one last desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling story. Father, you would believe a pregnant woman over your own flesh? The old chief's response came swift as a striking snake. I believe torn cloth that matches your shirt. I believe witnesses who risk death to speak truth. I believe my eyes when they see guilt written across your painted face. 2 warriors dismounted and bound Nasha's hands with leather strips. Tribal justice would be harsh, but fair. Exile or worse awaited those who murdered peacemakers for personal profit. The gunrunner scheme died with his capture. Jake lowered his rifle as tension drained from the morning air like water through cracked earth. 50 Apache warriors began dispersing, their mission complete but not in the way anyone had expected when dawn broke. The war chief approached Jake's porch with measured steps. You protected an innocent woman. This requires acknowledgement. Jake nodded, surprised by how light his chest felt without years of hatred weighing it down. She protected all of us. War would have killed people on both sides. Sitala placed her hand on her belly, speaking softly in Apache before switching to broken English. Baby, you deserve better world. The chief smiled, the first genuine warmth Jake had seen cross his weathered features. Children always do. As the Apache warriors disappeared into morning haze, Jake helped Satala back toward the cabin. Her wounds needed tending, and he had medical supplies that could help. But more importantly, he had something he'd lost during years of bitter fighting. Hope that enemies could become allies when justice mattered more than prejudice,